Hello, I'm Yvette Vasileva, and in this presentation I will examine the global impact of wet markets with reference to animal welfare, human health, and the cultural significance, using China as a case study. I will look at the definition of wet markets, give a brief historic overview, examine consumer motivations, look at recent socioeconomic trends, focus on the welfare concerns, stress, and zoonotic diseases, look at the history of epidemics emerging from wet markets, examine the debate over the closure of wet markets, offer several conclusion remarks, and suggest what more we can do. Wet markets comprise of open-air stalls selling fresh meat, fish, and other perishable goods such as fruits and vegetables. The name comes from the practice of washing down produce to keep it fresh. However, the name is also associated with the washing down of blood, entrails, and other fluids spilling from the stalls when animals are slaughtered. Wet markets can be found all over the world, but particularly Asia, Africa, and South America. The term wet market is used interchangeably to indicate the sale of live domesticated animals, fish, and wildlife, along other fresh produce. This has caused a lot of confusion and debate around the calls for a ban on wet markets, as not all sell wildlife and some do not even sell live animals. For the purposes of this presentation, I will use the term wet market to only indicate places that trade in live domesticated and wild animals, including aquatic animals, which are sold along other fresh produce. Wet markets originated from the so-called periodic markets, which emerged around the 16th century in China. It was only in the 20th century that permanent markets were established and became today's wet markets. Conventional supermarkets were first introduced in Hong Kong in the 1960s. The expansive growth in national and international supermarkets did not reduce the number of wet markets. Instead, a mixed-style shopping pattern emerged where people bought their dry and packaged food from the supermarket and fresh produce such as meat and vegetables from the wet market. The continued support and reliance on wet markets and consumption of exotic animals stems from a significant cultural difference. The general Chinese public does not typically separate medicine from food, and anything that is ingested could have beneficial or detrimental effects on the body. Live or freshly slaughtered animals are considered to be healthier than frozen meat. The main factors that motivate consumers to shop at wet markets are freshness of food, price, and social interaction. A study from 2019 by Zhong et al. Confirmed that the most significant motivation for Chinese consumers was freshness of produce. According to the study, freshness was positively correlated with immediacy, meaning that the shorter the time between harvesting and consumption, the better the food is. The article emphasized that consumers like to see live birds and swimming fish, observing them being butchered at the point of purchase and consuming them in hours. A study conducted in 2017 on price and quality difference between Chinese supermarkets and wet markets revealed that supermarket prices for vegetables were considerably higher, potentially due to higher quality, labor costs, operation expenditure, spoilage, and equipment. According to an ethnographic study conducted by Louis in 2008, the lucrative nature of supermarkets restricts the opportunity for more personal communication with customers. Markets offer an alternative to this, with the promise of meaningful social relations between producers and consumers, where the latter are given top priority status. A more recent study by Melee et al. Has shown that social element of wet markets is multi-layered, involving a variety of interactions across different ethnicities, generations, social statuses, and classes. Economic value and shopping habits play an important role in the debate for and against banning wet markets. Recent estimates show that there are approximately 44,000 wet markets in China. However, they have been increasingly falling behind supermarkets. A recent Euromonitor International report, as represented in the Bloomberg opinion, suggests that since 2010, traditional grocery shopping such as wet markets in China has been decreasing, with the most pronounced drops in the period between 2015 and 2019, as shown on the figure on the right. The Humane Society of the United States has also reported that the wildlife food industry represents just 0.17% of China's GDP and less than 1% of China's labor force of 900 million. These trends indicate that China may be transitioning to more modern types of grocery shopping, and closing down the live animal sections of wet markets may not be so economically devastating as otherwise suggested. The following slide contains images viewers may find disturbing. The main concern surrounding wet markets is their potential to negatively impact human and animal health and welfare. Animals at wet markets suffer from extremely poor welfare, mainly due to pain, fear, injury and disease, inhumane slaughter without stunning, dehydration and starvation, to mention just a few. The daily transportation of animals to and from wet markets and introduction of new animals, together with the already mentioned welfare issues, leads to severe stress and provides optimum conditions for amplification of disease. Moberg describes stress as biological response elicited when an individual perceives a threat to its homeostasis. In wet markets, animals are subjected to chronic stress, resulting from a series of acute stresses, such as crowded environment, unhygienic cages, restraint, close proximity to other animals, handling, as well as noise and confinement. Severe stresses, as those found in wet markets, increase the biological cost of coping, which depletes biological reserves very quickly, and if prolonged, the animal enters into a pre-pathological state. This leads to suppression of the immune system, which makes the animal susceptible to both environmental pathogens, such as those transmitted from other animals in close proximity, or even to dormant viruses developing within the organism. The longer the animal is stressed, as with more expensive wild animals staying longer at wet markets, the greater the opportunity for a pathology to develop. The effects of stress on animals not only lead to very poor welfare, but the conditions the live animals are subjected to in wet markets create a petri dish for the spread of disease. Stressed animals shed more viruses through urine, fecal matter, and other bodily fluids that are usually washed down and spread around a wet market. Some of these viruses are able to jump the species barrier and become infectious to humans and are defined as zoonotic. Wu et al. Describes zoonosis as disease caused by pathogens with vertebrate intermediates or reservoirs in which pathogens may or may not cause disease. There are over 200 known types of zoonosis, and both wild and domestic species have the potential to carry and transmit a variety of diseases. The list of animals sold in wet markets includes different birds, reptiles, insects, fish, and mammal species. The World Health Organization advises that wet markets selling wild animals are at high risk due to the largely unfamiliar pathogens these species may carry. For example, birds have been found to harbor 15 different zoonotic diseases and transmit Newcastle disease to farm poultry, while dogs and cats sold for food pose a significant risk to human health due to their potential to transmit rabies, cholera, and trichinosis. The transmission to humans may happen directly through contact or proximity to the natural animal reservoir or through consumption of its byproducts, which usually results in only small or sporadic outbreaks, as shown in Figure 3. Indirect transmission can occur when pathogens are transmitted from one animal, which is the natural reservoir, to another, which is the intermediate host. Under the new environment, new variants with higher transmissibility may emerge, as shown in Figure 4. In wet markets, animals of different species, which may not usually interact in nature, are closely packed together, which leads to wet markets becoming an amplification zone for disease. Over the last 2 decades, several deadly zoonotic diseases were identified to have originated at wet markets. Both wildlife and domesticated animals could be a source for a variety of diseases, as well as intermediate hosts. This is what makes wet markets such a prolific breeding ground for zoonosis, carrying the potential for the next pandemic. These two graphs from the Worldwide Fund for Nature depict the worst epidemics that resulted from zoonotic diseases, from both domesticated and wild animals, with SARS, avian influenza, and COVID-19 identified to have originated from wet markets. The avian influenza outbreak H5N1 in 1997, which began in Hong Kong, is an example of zoonotic epidemic emerging as a result of wet markets. Wu et al. Report that aquatic bird species are the natural reservoir for all known influenza A virus subtypes. The same avian influenza outbreak reoccurred in the early 2003 in live bird markets. A study by Yu et al. From 2007 concludes that wet markets are considered a reservoir and amplifier of avian influenza A viruses because they bring together avian host species in a high-density setting that can facilitate viral persistence, cross-species infection, and genetic reassortment, as shown in the figure on the right. In 2002, an epidemic of severe acute respiratory syndrome, SARS, began in wet markets across the Chinese province of Guangdong. It was suggested that bats were the reservoir species, with raccoon dogs and civet cats acting as intermediate hosts, facilitating efficient animal-to-human transmission. SARS resulted in 8,000 cases in 25 countries. The most devastating zoonotic disease in recent history, however, is the novel coronavirus named COVID-19, thought to have emerged from a wet market in Wuhan, China. COVID-19 is a similar zoonotic disease to SARS. The origin and natural reservoir of the virus are still debated and remain unconfirmed. However, it is believed that it originated in bats. Research into the virus is ongoing. However, the devastating effects of this coronavirus have sparked a debate over wet markets. The following slide will show video footage from Animal Equality, which some viewers may find disturbing. Many not-for-profit organizations such as Animal Equality and Peta are calling for an immediate ban on wet markets. The United Nations Biodiversity Chief has called for the permanent closure of wet markets. Even the Secretary General of the China Biodiversity Conservation and Green Development Foundation has urged authorities to make a global ban on wet markets due to the threat to global health. The director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases insisted on a global closure of wet markets because the current crisis is a direct result of this practice. On the other side of the debate are mainly academics as well as representatives of the World Health Organization, insisting that a global ban on wet markets is ill-informed and premature. The main concerns are that a ban would exacerbate poverty by destroying people's livelihoods and may drive the markets underground, making regulation impossible. Other concerns revolve around Western interference in long-standing cultural traditions, bordering on an attack on Chinese culture. Both of these viewpoints have merit. However, wet markets support the illegal wildlife trade by fulfilling a demand, which in turn has an impact on biodiversity, sustainability, and plays a major role in the spread of disease. Many insist that only sale and slaughter of wild animals is banned, but not wet markets themselves. However, as shown in this presentation, both domesticated and wildlife species play a role in the development of epidemics. The UN has stressed the importance of reducing meat consumption worldwide in order to keep climate change at bay. China is the global leader in almost all types of meat production. A ban on wet markets would be a small step towards a more sustainable future. The concerns that banning wet markets would be an attack on Chinese culture and tradition are not well founded. Meat eating is traditional in many countries, and this is being challenged on an international level. The poor welfare and stressful conditions animals are exposed to on wet markets create the perfect breeding ground for the spread of zoonotic disease. We live in a very globalized world, so cultural practices that impact global health could now be challenged on an international level, regardless of their origin. Concerns regarding loss of livelihoods and exacerbation of poverty in developing countries are important. A key to a more sustainable future for wet markets, while minimizing loss of jobs and alleviating hunger, could be a move towards production of more plant-based foods. A parallel could also be drawn with the practice of whaling, which was a very profitable industry for many years, yet regardless of economic impact or cultural significance, commercial whaling was banned in 1986. Finally, recent statistics show that people are ready, as shown by the graph on the right-hand side. Any decision on the ban of wet markets need to be made in the context of its contemporary significance, by weighing the costs and benefits of such practices and reducing bias by relying on existing facts. As I have hopefully demonstrated in this presentation, sale and slaughter of live domestic, wild and aquatic animals at wet markets carry many risks to animal and human health and welfare, supported by a wealth of scientific evidence. The crucial factor when advocating for a ban on wet markets is about preserving the economic and cultural significance of fresh produce markets, but banning the sale and slaughter of any live animals in order to prevent future pandemics. So what can we do as consumers? You can help by urging the United Nations and the World Health Organization to put an end to live animal markets worldwide by supporting any of these initiatives. Thank you for listening.